about the SRE Engagement Model and the components of this model. First, you'll learn about the SRE service lifecycle and how it compares to the traditional software development lifecycle. Next, you'll learn the steps for setting up and building SRE service relationships and a roadmap for sprints and communication. Next, you'll learn how to measure the impact of the SRE engagement, setting ground rules for SRE teams, and how to sustain effective relationships with other SREs and developers. Finally, you'll learn about the steps to take for scaling SRE to larger environments and the steps for ending an engagement. Lastly, you'll review case studies to see the results of how the SRE engagement model was used in real life. One overriding goal when supporting a service through its entire lifecycle, and that is to increase service reliability. An SRE team brings knowledge to the table gathered by their experience with other services, and this can be crucial to the success of the service. They're also teachers, teaching the development team best practices for reliance throughout the lifecycle. In this video, we're going to look at the level of SRE involvement throughout the different phases of the service lifecycle, and the type of guidance that an SRE team can offer throughout the cycle. While an SRE team can and should offer advice through the entire service lifecycle, not surprisingly, their level of involvement varies depending on the lifespan phase. SRE teams are typically very involved in the architecture and design phase. It's in this phase that they have the most potential influence on standards and reliability considerations in the overall architecture and design. They're less involved in the development phase. In this phase, the development team does most of the work, and the SRE team may have guidance on things such as testing, code reviews, and coding standards. The SRE team's involvement rises once a service is released to users. During a limited availability release, where only a small number of users have access, the SRE team is engaged because it's their responsibility to measure reliability and get feedback from users. The SRE team kicks into operational mode when the service is open for general availability to all users. This is when the SRE team will get the best feedback on reliability of the service in production. And the SRE team is involved to a lesser degree when the service is eventually deprecated. So let's look at the SRE team's involvement and generally how they can help. The SRE team drives best practices, from coding practices to testing and design practices. This is best driven early in the service lifetime, so bad habits don't result in problems in later phases. SRE teams have experience and can share this experience to warn the development team of common pitfalls. For example, the SRE team may warn the development team that there are specific types of database design that do not work well with the type of services being built. When the SRE team is engaged early, they can inject concerns for reliability into the architecture and design phases. In this way, reliability will trickle from there through to the rest of the lifecycle. They can also review and validate the architecture and design work being done by the development team. While SRE teams are great for overseeing architecture and design, they're also developers themselves and can participate in the development phase if required. This is a good opportunity for pair programming to underline coding standards and best practices. And as well as pair programming, SREs can perform co-designing with developers, designing alongside them, again to guide them in best practices and sharing their knowledge. Let's look at the SRE participation by the phases of the service lifecycle. As mentioned, in the architecture and design phase, SREs can oversee the architecture and design, inject reliability concerns, give advice, and even fix errors. This can have a tremendous positive effect on the whole service lifecycle. In the development phase, the SRE team works to prepare the service for production. They can perform resource and capacity planning as part of this to ensure that the environment is ready for the deployment of the service. During a limited availability release, the SRE team gets to measure reliability for the first time. This will either validate that the proper reliability planning has taken place, or signal that the team needs to take a closer look at reliability of the service. And when general availability is achieved, this is when the SRE team offers full support of the service from an operational perspective, handling all aspects of the release. An important note here is that even though the goal is usually for the SRE team to take over production responsibility of the service after general availability, the development team should still have some exposure to the support aspect in production, so they keep in touch with the service. This will improve the development efforts by giving context. Now let's look at the final phase of a service, and that's deprecation. Throughout the service's time and general availability, the SRE team is fully engaged in supporting the operations of the service, and this really simply continues throughout deprecation. However, they will presumably be working to support the successor service to the one being deprecated, so their time will be split between the deprecated service and the new one. The first part of the deprecation phase is when the service is abandoned, meaning no more new features are going to be added to it, and those using it need to start moving to the new service. During this time, the SRE team will continue to do incident management for the service. And at some point, the old service is unsupported. There should no longer be anyone using it, and the SRE team would tear the service down, deleting all resources pertaining to it in production and ensuring a smooth transition to the new service. SRE engagement applies to all levels of the service lifecycle. In this video, we're going to look at what an SRE team focuses on at each phase of the service lifecycle. We'll look at the design phase, where SREs bring their architecture and design expertise to the table, the development phase, where their focus is ensuring the service is production ready, the limited availability phase, where the focus is on measuring reliability, the general availability phase, where the SRE team drives the maturity of the service, and finally, the deprecation phase, where the SRE team helps transition from the old deprecated service to a new service. In the design phase, the development team needs to design the service and determine how it will fit in with the overall architecture. If they're replacing an old service with a new one, they've probably followed the old service throughout its life cycle, and therefore have a lot of preconceived notions as to what the new service should be. When the SRE team engages with the development team, they ideally bring a new perspective. They have experience of not just the service in question, but the system as a whole, both at a technical and business level. They'll help the development team determine what new features should be added to the service to best serve the business. SREs also have a view into the service level agreements that need to be met by the new service. These agreements define the service level indicators and service level objectives that define the level of reliability expected. This is a view that the development team, who are primarily focused on the technical aspects, may be lacking on their own. In the development phase, the development team is busy building out the new features. The SRE team, on the other hand, are ensuring that the service is ready for production. This goes beyond the technical aspects of the features. They need to consider such aspects as capacity planning, which is what resources are required in production to handle future capacity, resource redundancy, planning for data spikes, handling overloads, and considering load balancing. These are all aspects that development teams often don't consider when developing the feature logic. SREs also consider how the service will be monitored for reliability. This aids in performance tuning and includes alerting when reliability criteria are not being met. In the limited availability phase, the service is released to a subset of users. In this phase, the SRE team gets to measure the reliability of the service live by collecting metrics of how the service is managing traffic and its uptime. The SRE team can now focus on preparing a capacity model for future releases and ensuring the service is automated for scaling when demand increases. The SRE team are into operations mode at this point and should transfer operational knowledge of the service in production to the development team. Too often I've seen a separation between the development and SRE or operations team, where the development team doesn't know the realities of how the service is behaving in production. It's imperative that the development team has this operations context, so this knowledge transfer is important. In the general availability phase, the service is released to all users. The SRE team continues with the operational work of running and monitoring the service in production. As that goes on, the development team is shadowing the SRE team and learning about managing the service operationally. At the same time, the development team is also maturing the service by releasing further features and bug fixes. The final phase of the SRE lifecycle is deprecating the service. This is a point at which a new service is being designed to take over the old one. There are two aspects to deprecation of a service, and the SRE team is involved in both. First, the service is abandoned, meaning that no further work will occur on it. At this point, the development team is working on the new service. The SRE team is usually still supporting the old service, since there are still customers using it before the transition. The next and final stage is when the service is no longer supported. Then the SRE team deletes the service from production and works with the development team to ensure a smooth transition to the new service. Throughout a service's lifecycle, development teams and SRE teams really have different primary goals. The development team's goal is to build out the service, while the SRE team's goal is to ensure the service's reliability. While their goals might be different, they're not independent. The development team needs to build functionality with reliability in mind, and the SRE team needs to consider the functionality being built in order to plan for reliability. Now, there is a third team to consider as well, the product team, which handles the service from a business perspective, dealing with such things as marketing and user expectations. These teams need to communicate effectively in order to achieve their goals, as well as to determine common risks to the service. In this video, we're going to focus on communication between these multiple teams. In this communication between teams, the SRE team plays a pivotal role. First, they need to understand the expectations of the development team. If they're not on the same page as a development team, then the service is not going to be developed with reliability in mind. They also have to be in tune with the business goals of the product team. They have to have a mutual understanding of the service level agreements, which define the reliability targets. The SRE team are the team that synchronizes what the development team is building with the goals of the product team. To achieve this, the SRE team needs to be clear on their roles and responsibility as arbiters of reliability. They should also hold regular meetings with both development and product teams to guarantee that business and technical priorities are in line. So how can these three teams be more effective in their communications? Each team needs strong leadership. This leader needs to be able to effectively collaborate with the other teams. In my experience, some teams, particularly development teams, work as a headless team, meaning that nobody has these collaboration skills. This will hamper the teams from working together and being effective. When teams are working together, there needs to be strong written skills. Written skills are a prerequisite of effective communication. Written communications need to be clear and as objective as possible to minimize misunderstandings. And it's important to choose collaboration tools, such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams, that work for all three teams. The communication channels need to be open among the teams at all times. In reality, the relationship between the product team and other teams will be one primarily of information sharing, while the SRE and development teams will be working closely side by side much of the time. Therefore, it's crucial that the SRE and development teams align their goals. The SRE team goals are reliability and the long-term health of the system, whereas the development team goals are development of features. Now, there's a lot of overlap here. For instance, following coding standards during feature development is a step toward reliability, while reliability goals are going to have an impact on design. These two teams need to align their goals. They'll need to have common goals, and this will involve compromise. There are technical realities to how reliable a service can be, for example, and some features envisioned by the development team might not fit into the overall vision for long-term viability held by the SRE team. The point is, these teams cannot be at odds, or the service will not meet commitments to the customers. It's the SRE team's responsibility to identify risks, and they need to communicate these to both the development team and the product team. To do this, the SRE team needs to take the following steps. They need to determine the scope of each risk. What does the risk mean to the system as a whole? Once the scope is determined, the SRE team needs to rank the risks from highest to lowest priority. Based on the threat level, the SRE team needs to determine a mitigation of risks. This will involve communication with the development team to determine a technical strategy, as well as keeping the product team informed, so they can understand the risks and mitigations from a business perspective. And finally, the SRE team is responsible for monitoring and reviewing these risks with the goal of avoiding them. Should these risks occur, the SRE team must communicate with the development and product teams accordingly. The SRE team and the development team for a service need to communicate throughout their respective sprints. They'll both be focusing on application architecture. They both need to work to achieve reliability goals, which affects the architecture. Their respective sprints will have different goals. The development team will be building out new functionality, while the SRE team will be focused on reliability efforts. Some of these goals will overlap, so the two teams will get together in a planning session to determine steps forward and collaborate on shared goals. Both teams will perform the development cycle to achieve their goals. The SRE and development teams will meet in the following standard meetings. Production readiness review meetings will drive both the development and SRE teams toward a shared responsibility for increasing the service's reliability. When launch time gets close, the teams will meet for service launch meetings to discuss launch details and make sure the service is ready for launch. And there will be regular retrospective meetings so the teams can discuss together what went well and what didn't work as well, and actions will be taken to improve. By sharing these common meetings, the SRE team and development team are working toward a common set of goals. To understand how an SRE team communicates effectively, you need to understand the general structure of the team. An SRE team has a tech lead. This person drives a technical direction. They're typically ones who provide technical guidance and review code. They strive to build a common strategy technically between the SRE team and the development team. There's usually a manager who is technically minded, who takes the lead on issues that are not handled by the tech lead, and they ensure performance of the service. The project manager handles everything at the project level, such as design documentation. An SRE team is most effective when the tasks of these roles are not set in stone. In the best SRE teams, all of these roles are capable of handling the above-mentioned work. All of them should also be technical, in that they could jump in and write code if required. SRE teams need to stay on top of the status of the service. To do this, they hold production meetings. This regular meeting includes review of action items, so the team knows what was completed since the last meeting, and new action items to be completed and reviewed next time. Reviewing these action items essentially tells the team what the current state of the service is. They'll review paging events, which are events important enough that someone was notified. They'll go over the details, such as what happened, who was contacted, root cause, and how it was resolved. They'll also go over non-paging events. These may be events that should have resulted in a page but didn't, or events that may be worth reviewing but simply didn't require a notification. The SRE team will also discuss upcoming changes to the production environment. They'll discuss when these will occur, as well as the expected effects and risks. The team will discuss metrics and service level indicators, and service level objectives might be adjusted. And finally, outages will be reviewed, and the team will note how to avoid such outages in the future. In conclusion, During their sprints, the SRE and development teams will often get together to make sure they're on the same page. Additionally, the SRE team will have a production meeting to review what's happening with the service from a reliability viewpoint and adjust accordingly. In general, it seems logical that introducing an SRE team to the service lifecycle should improve reliability and generally result in a more mature service. But the only way to really know what effect an SRE team's engagement has had on the service is to measure the impact quantitatively. One way to do this is to measure the service's maturity at the beginning of the engagement using a maturity matrix. This would take such SRE relevant factors into account as capacity planning, change management, and responses to incidents. To make it quantitative, there should be an agreement on how these are measured using some numbering system. The same maturity matrix can then be reevaluated after the engagement. Comparing the maturity matrices before and after engagement should show what effect the SRE team engagement has had on the service's reliability. One could argue that it's the user experience where reliability measurements are most relevant. So you could measure the server-side latency, that is, how long it takes from the server receiving a request to the completion of that request. While this can be useful for diagnostics, it's not client-facing, so it doesn't give you the true latency experienced by the customer. This is like trying to measure how quickly a fast food restaurant is serving customers by only measuring how long it takes a backroom staff to assemble the meal. It ignores the client-facing aspect, which in the case of the fast food restaurant is the person at the till, and in the case of the service is a network between the customer and the server, as well as the customer's browser. Instead, you can measure client-side latency by having script in the front end specifically to measure this at the client browser and report it back. This gives a better idea of reliability for the customer. There are tools, such as Google PageSpeed, that can measure this latency and offer suggestions for improvement. Now, it's great to say measure the customer experience, but how do you do that? There is a naive approach of looking at median latency as an availability percentage. This is simply the average percentage of times a response is valid, as opposed to returning an error. So if a given endpoint returns an error every fourth call, the availability would be 75%. The problem with this metric is that it doesn't take slow responses into consideration. Say instead of simply failing, those 1 in 4 responses were valid responses that took 10 seconds to return. Now, a user is probably not going to wait those 10 seconds before they assume the application is stopped, so those might as well be failures. There is a slightly better metric called long-tail latency, which uses the same calculation for availability as median latency, but includes responses past an acceptable delay as if they were errors. But how do you know what the acceptable cutoff is for latency with long-tail latency? Well, this is called the 99th percentile latency. Google has done tests, and they suggest you choose as your 99th percentile latency nothing larger than 3 to 5 times what the average latency is. So for example, if a service's average latency is 500 milliseconds, then you should choose a cutoff for long-tail latency somewhere between 1.5 seconds and 2.5 seconds. Availability is not the only latency metric you should consider. There are others related specifically to data, such as freshness, which refers to how long it takes for ingested data at the server to be available for the client. So far, we've discussed measuring a service based on its current performance. SRE should also consider future load. This is called demand forecasting, or determining what future demand will be on the service given certain knowns. It tries to predict the service load in the future. There are various different measures of service load, such as memory usage, storage size, bandwidth, or queries per second. When performing demand forecasting, one must consider two types of growth. Organic growth is growth that can be extrapolated from historical factors. There are many statistical methods for determining organic growth of a system. One might want to use several different statistical models to determine the expected organic growth of the system over time. The inorganic growth must also be considered. This cannot be extrapolated from historical data because it's usually caused by one-time events, such as specific user behavior. While inorganic growth cannot be predicted statistically from history, such events can sometimes be anticipated. For example, you might anticipate a temporary surge of users when a new feature is released. So how can SREs measure the efficiency of their service? One common method is load testing. Load testing should be run on a regular basis. It should test how many user requests per second a service can handle before failing. Even with load testing, a service's weaknesses may not be known by the SRE until a product outage occurs, resulting in system failure. Due to the behavior of load balancers, for example, a few server instances failing can actually cascade into multiple failures, as the load balancer redirects traffic and overloads other instances. This can become a retrospective item where the SREs must determine how to avoid any future occurrences. One common way to avoid such a disaster is to build outage prevention into the system. For instance, a system can randomly drop certain requests when there are service outages to actively avoid a complete cascading failure. An SRE team carries a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. In order to be effective, team members need to collaborate effectively. In this video, we're going to look at ways that SRE teams can set ground rules that will make them function more effectively. First, SRE teams have to set goals. They have short-term goals. They're responsible for making sure that services they manage fulfill the business needs they were created for. They need to ensure scalability of service, which is something you want to build into the service right from the start. And they also need to ensure maintainability, again, ideally from the start of the service. These factors will ensure the service has a long, useful life. The SRE team also has longer-term goals, such as making sure that operations are as optimized as possible. This usually happens over many iterations of the service. They want to minimize human interaction over time through automation. And they want to train others, such as an operations team, so that they can hand the project off. An SRE team, being highly knowledgeable, should move on to a different service once someone is trained to take over the operations of the current one. Regular meetings keep the SRE team on track to meet these goals, and these meetings need to be effective. So to start off, let's look at effective ways to introduce ground rules in meetings. The first step is to clearly explain the ground rules and explain why they're important. For ground rules to be effective, everyone has to understand them. Next, it's important to seek input from everyone in the meeting and take the input into consideration when setting the ground rules. This gives everyone an opportunity to be involved in setting the rules, so they're more likely to agree to them. Once everyone has had their say, confirm that everyone agrees to the new ground rules. There needs to be a consequence to not following the rules. This may be as simple as someone pointing out the violation by knocking on the table 3 times, and perhaps you have to give the opportunity to speak to someone else. The point is, everyone must agree on what the penalty for violation is. Make sure to distribute the rules or display them in the meeting so it's certain everyone can reference them. And every time you start a meeting, remind everyone about the rules. Now, there are certain ground rules that are specific to SRE teams. The team should agree to define the scope of the operational work that they need to accomplish before starting that work. There's no way to determine status of an SRE's operational work if it's not defined in detail. Before starting operational work, service level objectives should be assigned. Eventually, these are required to measure the effect of the SRE team's work, so it's best to define them up front. The team should agree to stick to an error budget when discussing things such as release velocity or service capacity. An error budget defines how far from ideal such vectors can get before it's a pain point for the customer. So keeping track of this will keep the team on track for servicing the customer needs of reliability. And the SRE team should agree to the ground rule of development engagement in operations. Developers will get a better grip on issues and their root causes when they're versed with the current operational state of the service. The next proposed ground rules are more generic for technical teams. These can apply to SRE teams, but may apply to other teams as well. I know from experience that technical teams can get obsessed with discussing solutions ad infinitum. To keep the team forward-thinking and not going down a rabbit hole of technical solutions, there should be a ground rule that the conversation stick to identifying needs as opposed to getting too focused on solutions. It's also easy to fall into the trap of basing decisions on opinions. The team should agree to test assumptions. This keeps the focus on measured facts as opposed to opinions which may be flawed. Team members must be required to work collaboratively with the rest of the team. Collaboration increases everyone's commitment. And there are some difficult topics that the team might try to avoid, such as why the service is too slow. These are exactly the topics that need discussion, so lay down a ground rule that pain points will be discussed. When it comes to communication in meetings, people should try to state their views clearly, and an atmosphere of being open about opinions and asking questions for clarity should be fostered. There should be ground rules laid down for how information is shared among the team members. Perhaps this is a minutes of the meeting that's emailed out or shared on a wiki. It's good to have a glossary of terms so definitions are clarified and everyone is talking the same language. And when decisions are made, it should be a ground rule that reason and intent is clearly shared. People can't work as a team if they don't all understand the reasons behind what they're doing. To deliver a service that meets all of the functional and reliability requirements of the customer, the SRE team and development team need to plan for a service delivery and then execute on that plan. Generally, the teams need to develop a roadmap of what they're planning to deliver. There are many different development methodologies that a development team and the corresponding SRE team can follow for the actual execution, such as rapid application development or agile. In this video, we're going to consider the planning and execution of a service by a development team and an SRE team using RAD, or Rapid Application Development. First, the teams would get together to hold a strategic planning workshop during the architecture and design phase of the service lifecycle. This workshop would take several weeks and would take both internal factors into consideration, such as what technical resources are required, what platforms will be required to meet scalability needs, or whether the network will handle the traffic, as well as external business factors, such as the competition in the marketplace for the service. Note that the strategic planning workshop doesn't yet consider the actual design of the service, but is rather an analysis of internal and external factors that may affect it. Also note that both development and SRE teams should be involved. Next comes service definition. A definition workshop of 3 to 6 weeks is held, in which both development and SRE teams work to understand what the existing service does if one exists, and consider technical requirements for the new service features, such as the network architecture, security, scalability, and reliability. Business processes are also considered to see how they would affect the delivery. For example, how does a new functionality fit with how the users will actually use the system? How will the users be trained on the new service? After design, the SRE team and development team should have a common understanding of what is to be built out for the service. At this point, the development team can begin to create prototypes which demonstrate their understanding of what the service might be. While the development team does this, the SRE team can focus on the infrastructure for the service, ensuring such things as security, scalability, and reliability. The SRE and development teams would then work together to test these prototypes, and individual team members can give their feedback. It's a good idea to get the customer feedback at this point as well. This feedback can feed further iterations of prototypes built by the development team. Once the SRE team, the development team, and the customer feel that a prototype covers the intended requirements sufficiently, including requirements for reliability, a pilot can be built and released to a chosen group of customers for feedback. The feedback elicited can be fed into further iterations of pilots to get closer and closer to the final product. Meanwhile, the SRE team can be performing internal load and stress testing to test the reliability of the pilot service. Once the pilot is evolved to the final service, the team that will take over production responsibilities, and this is usually initially the SRE team, prepares for operational activities and also prepares to handle any incidents in production. Data is moved from the old system, if one exists, to the new system if necessary. And finally, the installation occurs and the SRE team handles the system operations in production, training the development teams on operations as time goes by. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, services developed by a development team with an SRE team working with them to manage reliability can be performed in any number of development methodologies. This video discusses if the methodology were RAD, but it could just as easily be Agile or Waterfall. The important takeaway is that the SRE team is engaged ideally right at the beginning of the process, in the architecture and design phase, and they're involved in reviews of the evolving prototypes and pilots to the final product. In this way, reliability is baked right into the service from the start. To support a service's growth and reliability, the SRE team needs to have an effective relationship with the development team. In this video, we're going to look at how to sustain that effective relationship. We're going to look at this through the lens of a customer-centric approach in an organization and how that might foster relationships between teams. A customer-centric approach necessarily leads to a service-centric culture, meaning that the focus is not on individuals so much as the services as they offer benefit to the customer. A strong relationship between SRE and development teams fosters service reliability and longevity, thereby feeding into this customer-centric approach. One key aspect of the SRE development relationship is the transfer of knowledge. SRE teams are meant not just to manage the service, but to teach the development team how to manage it. The knowledge transfer goes the other way as well, since the development team must train the SRE team on the existing service. I've seen that often teams grow insular, protecting their knowledge internally instead of sharing it, which is the opposite of what has to happen between an SRE team and a development team. However, with a service-centric culture, both teams share a common goal, and that is to deliver value to the customer through the service. This common goal will naturally lead to a more open sharing of knowledge between teams. To serve the customer, the organization should be people-focused, process-focused, and finally technology-focused in that order. Because it's not just technology that feeds customer value, but the human relationships and creativity behind the technology. The relationships between SREs and developers are at the center of the people focus, since they're responsible for delivering the customer value. So if their relationships break down or are ineffective, the customer-centric approach fails. So what can be done to foster the relationships between SREs and developers? First, determine the success factors for each. In a customer-focused approach, their ultimate success is the same: value for the customer. Their ways of achieving this are overlapped but different. Success should be celebrated for both developers delivering features as well as SREs delivering operational stability and reliability. Relationships will break down if one team feels more recognized than the other for their successes. The SRE team and development team must work together, so create a strategic plan that lists the steps required for their successful journey together through the service lifecycle. An internal culture must be sustained that values collaboration toward the shared goal of delivering customer value. This means, for instance, that everyone, SREs and developers, are celebrated for customer successes, regardless of the breakdown of work. In essence, treat the two teams more as one from a goals perspective. SREs and developers should keep a playbook of how each aspect of the service lifecycle will play out to keep everyone on the same track. How SREs and developers interact with one another can foster or hinder an effective relationship. When having meetings, both teams should focus on inter-team interactions that generate some value. For example, the development team might propose a new monitoring feature that will help the SRE team in production. The SRE team might propose a platform that will simplify the development effort by avoiding code duplication. In an effective relationship, both sides constantly bring something positive to the table. It may be difficult for developers to see what benefits an SRE team is having on the final product. This doubt that the SRE team is delivering might lead to negative feelings in the development team, and as a result, breakdown of the effective relationship. There should be objective metrics in place in production that show the positive effect when an SRE suggested change is put in place. This positive feedback will instill in the teams that the changes being proposed are useful and worthwhile, and this will boost the inter-team relationship. SRE teams and development teams must be able to collaborate together easily. Foster this by setting up and encouraging several forms of collaboration, such as email, texting, and teleconferencing. As mentioned, a common focus on servicing user needs will help to foster effective relationships between SRE teams and development teams. SREs and developers will have a stronger relationship if they're encouraged to ask questions of one another. This will help understanding among the teams. And common understanding will also foster effective relationships. So the team should have visibility into the user needs and requirements. Successful at delivering scalable solutions inevitably grow. As your company's product list grows, so does your requirements for development and SRE resources. SREs are highly skilled resources, and therefore relatively hard to come by. There are typically far fewer SREs in the company than developers. But with many services involved in many products, you need to find a way to scale your SRE resources for the larger environment. Let's start out by discussing ways to organize SREs and engage them with development teams in ways that are most effective. Your SRE teams will probably need to team up with multiple development teams because, as mentioned, the ratio of SRE to developer is low. You want as little overhead as possible when the SREs switch context between the teams, so it's good to pair up a given SRE team with dev teams that support services which are all part of the same product. The SREs can then reuse knowledge of the product between teams. It's also best if the dev teams that an SRE team engages use similar tech stacks. It's harder on the SRE team if they have to jump between dev teams that code in C# and Visual Basic, for example. It's ideal if the various services the SRE team supports are written by the same development team, or only a few development teams. Minimizing the number of teams the SRE team needs to interact with simplifies communication. When you have multiple SRE teams, you need to organize them. You may have products organized in product areas. SREs should be assigned a product area. Product areas are further broken down into product groups, each focused on a given product. SREs can be further broken into these groups. Developer teams can be organized in the same manner to be matched up with SRE teams. Again, it's always best if SRE teams and dev teams are matched up by product and tech stack. This organization facilitates that. Now let's discuss some common challenges as you scale your SRE teams. When you have SRE teams jumping around trying to meet the needs of multiple development teams, you may lose team cohesiveness. That is, SRE teams and dev teams need to work closely together like a single unit. If an SRE team can't spend enough time with a dev team, this may not happen as effectively. If there's a loss of team cohesiveness, there may also be less of a feeling of openness, that is, a safe environment for asking questions and sharing one's opinions. And the SRE team, if bounced around too much between dev teams, may be challenged with adapting to the different needs of the teams. As you get more SRE teams, you need to remember to train them in regards to business skills. It's imperative that your SRE teams have business skills so they can communicate effectively. Your SRE teams also need to understand the technical requirements of the services that they're helping with. With more SRE teams and more dev teams, this can mean more formal training. And prioritization of bugs and issues becomes more of a challenge with more SRE teams and development teams. For instance, when prioritizing for a product, there may be issues from several services to consider. And as an overall prioritization list of the organization, there may be several products to consider. With more teams comes more of an opportunity for resistance to change. With more teams needing to interact and collaborate, your SREs are going to get pushback from certain ideas. The SREs will need to learn skills to deal with this. A larger organization usually means distributed teams, which brings another dimension of complexity to the communications. So SRE teams will need to learn how to deal with the challenges of distributed teams. And with more teams comes resource changes. Teams must be managed in such a way as to minimize the disruption when teams change, either from people leaving or coming on board. This is often handled by effective knowledge sharing and onboarding training. So in conclusion, a growing organization will have to scale SRE teams, and this can be challenging. This is handled through appropriate organization of teams, as well as proper training for SREs to handle complexities, such as more collaboration, resistance to change, and distributed and changing teams. I'm going to look at a Google case study which casts light on the SRE Engagement Model. The Data Analysis Pipeline case study demonstrates that it's difficult to determine when to disengage an SRE team, but that sometimes that tough decision needs to be made for the better of the project. The Data Analysis Pipeline case study is one of team dynamics. To set the context, there was team dysfunction between the SRE team and the development team on the project. This dysfunction had been going on for a while, to the point where communication was already breaking down between the teams by the time the inciting incident occurred, which we're going to talk about. So there were multiple indicators that the teams were not communicating and working together effectively for some time, and yet nobody had made the call to disengage the SRE team. It's important to realize that this was probably because such a call is difficult to make. Team dynamics don't change overnight. They gradually decline. And it's challenging to know when the time comes for disengagement, which is a big step. The two teams were eventually misaligned, meaning they had separate goals and objectives, and communication had broken down completely. Now, with the teams so misaligned, came the inciting incident that eventually caused the disengagement of the SRE team. It had become obvious that scale was going to be a concern for the solution. so the development team decided to create a new service rather than try to refactor the old one. While the development team worked full steam ahead on the new service, the SRE team was left to manage operations of the old system until such time as it could be abandoned. This put the teams in a position where they were completely misaligned in their efforts, working on different goals. The problem was the scaling requirements came quickly, and until the new service was ready, there was only the old service to manage these new scaling demands. Because the development team was only doing changes to the old system if it was considered not too risky, the old system got minimal updates. The old system stagnated and fell behind the new requirements for scalability. In this scenario, the two teams had no compelling reason to communicate. The SRE team was focused on supporting the old service and maintaining its reliability, while the development team was on the completely different task of developing the new service. Remember, the communication had already been breaking down between the teams, and now the new arrangement only served to exacerbate the lack of communication. As requirements for scalability grew and could not be sufficiently met by either team, the stress level grew. The eventual solution was to disengage the SRE team that was looking after the old service and hand control of both old and new services to the development team. This helped management, since they now had a single team that could respond to the work that the managers were accountable for. In short, the single team was more responsive than two non-communicating teams. The development team had the knowledge base to handle both old and new services, although the operational load was stressful, especially at first. In the end, the development team kept operational control of the new service. If the SRE team and development team had been able to re-establish effective communication, the SRE team could have come in once the dust settled and helped by taking over operations of the new service. Unfortunately, that was not possible in this case. In summary, the data analysis pipeline case study shows that communication is essential to the effective working of an SRE team engagement. There are certain conditions in which it makes more sense to end that engagement rather than continue and try to case study done by Google, which shows how a common platform team called REs was able to aid collaboration between two teams, the Google Abuse SRE team and the team that managed the Common Abuse tool, also called CAT. This case study shows one unique solution to enabling the SRE engagement model when development efforts appear to contradict the SRE engagement model tenets. The CAT team provided anti-abuse protection for Google services. As such, they needed to respond quickly to issues, as they needed to meet users' high expectations for safety. The CAT team was overburdened, so the Google Abuse SRE team engaged to ease CAT's operational burden. This worked well, so the CAT team was able to focus on value to the customer instead of the operational overhead of their services. The Google Abuse SRE team did notice, however, that the services generated by the CAT team had many different architectures that added complexity to the operational work that they'd taken over. Further, the CAT team was making requests to build new services quickly because they needed to be flexible to issues. The Google Abuse SRE team found that they had to push back on many of these requests because their goals conflicted with those of the CAT team. The CAT team, acting as a support team for anti-abuse, relied on rapid solution delivery and flexible solutions. The Google Abuse SRE team, on the other hand, as an SRE team, were focused on carefully planning work that met standards with a focus on reliability, which could work against the rapid solution delivery and flexible solutions required by the CAT team. The solution that Google came up with was to introduce a sub-team within CAT called REs. REs was tasked with creating a common framework which would be reliable and which would also allow rapid application on top of it. This REs team acted as an SRE team within the CAT team, doing the operations work of maintaining a common framework. This common framework served to make CAT services that were architecturally diverse more consistent. The functionality, such as logging and storage, were written as microservices, forming a layer of common code that met standards and could be reused in all CAT rapidly designed services. Not only did this standardize the CAT team's services while allowing them to be rapidly developed, it also simplified deployment, since there were now far fewer discrepancies among the services deployed, since they were all built on a common framework. So the result was a quicker time to production for CAT team services, allowing them to rapidly respond to abuse issues with new services. The common framework also eased the operational burden of the Google Abuse SRE team, because the services were no longer architecturally diverse, but instead all based on the same framework. And finally, this served the Google Abuse SRE team's requirements for reliability, because the reliability of common functionality was built into the framework and not spread throughout the various services. So in conclusion, the formation of the ARES team to build a common framework is a great example of how a common framework can help bridge the gap between the strict quality and reliability requirements of the SRE team and the need for rapid deployment that is often the concern of support teams like the CAT team. In this video, we're going to look at a Google case study which casts light on the SRE Engagement Model. The Data Analysis Pipeline case study demonstrates that it's difficult to determine when to disengage an SRE team, but that sometimes that tough decision needs to be made for the better of the project. The Data Analysis Pipeline case study is one of team dynamics. To set the context, there was team dysfunction between the SRE team and the development team on the project. This dysfunction had been going on for a while, to the point where communication was already breaking down between the teams by the time the inciting incident occurred, which we're going to talk about. So there were multiple indicators that the teams were not communicating and working together effectively for some time, and yet nobody had made the call to disengage the SRE team. It's important to realize that this was probably because such a call is difficult to make. Team dynamics don't change overnight. They gradually decline. And it's challenging to know when the time comes for disengagement, which is a big step. The two teams were eventually misaligned, meaning they had separate goals and objectives, and communication had broken down completely. Now, with the teams so misaligned, came the inciting incident that eventually caused the disengagement of the SRE team. It had become obvious that scale was going to be a concern for the solution, so the development team decided to create a new service rather than try to refactor the old one. While the development team worked full steam ahead on the new service, the SRE team was left to manage operations of the old system until such time as it could be abandoned. This put the teams in a position where they were completely misaligned in their efforts, working on different goals. The problem was the scaling requirements came quickly, and until the new service was ready, there was only the old service to manage these new scaling demands. Because the development team was only doing changes to the old system if it was considered not too risky, the old system got minimal updates. The old system stagnated and fell behind the new requirements for scalability. In this scenario, the two teams had no compelling reason to communicate. The SRE team was focused on supporting the old service and maintaining its reliability, while the development team was on the completely different task of developing the new service. Remember, the communication had already been breaking down between the teams, and now the new arrangement only served to exacerbate the lack of communication. As requirements for scalability grew and could not be sufficiently met by either team, the stress level grew. The eventual solution was to disengage the SRE team that was looking after the old service and hand control of both old and new services to the development team. This helped management, since they now had a single team that could respond to the work that the managers were accountable for. In short, the single team was more responsive than two non-communicating teams. The development team had the knowledge base to handle both old and new services, although the operational load was stressful, especially at first. In the end, the development team kept operational control of the new service. If the SRE team and development team had been able to re-establish effective communication, the SRE team could have come in once the dust settled and helped by taking over operations of the new service. Unfortunately, that was not possible in this case. In summary, the data analysis pipeline case study shows that communication is essential to the effective working of an SRE team engagement. There are certain conditions in which it makes more sense to end that engagement rather than continue and try to make it work. SRE Engagement Model and the components of this model. We did this by exploring SRE service lifecycle and its phases, SRE service relationship building, sprints, and communications, measuring impact of engagement and setting ground rules for SRE teams, how SRE teams plan, execute, and sustain effective relationships in their teams, scaling SRE for larger environments and how to end SRE engagements, and case studies of an SRE engagement model.